Hello. Research, even very good research, often fails to influence policy and fails to influence policymakers. Why is that? Why can't good evidence get used much more readily? We found some clues in a study I did for the International Development Research Center, published as Research to Policy, but also included in a chapter in the UNESCO book, Social Science and Policy Challenges. At the International Development Research Center, we wanted to understand how to get evidence into use more effectively. IDRC, as you may know, supports development research, so there really should be some sort of policy impact in a number of cases. But we really did not understand the whole process, and like many researchers, we tended to focus on doing very good research, thinking naively that if we did good research, it would get used. In the evaluation unit, which I was running at the time, we could see that there was a problem with that logic, that if we were not more intentional about the research and how it could influence policy, it was not so likely to happen. So we did two things. We engaged Carol Weiss, who is the preeminent thinker on policy evaluation in the world, and we identified cases where an IDRC program officer thought there had been some sort of policy influence, and we tried to understand how did that happen. Not whether it happened, but how. So we took a positive sample because we weren't concerned about what proportion of IDRC work and research influenced policy, but rather in a better understanding of the mechanisms of how that happened. So we looked at 23 diverse cases of policy influence in many different fields. 4 of those cases were in Latin America. 2 of them resulted in policy influence and 2 did not, and I'll come back to those after I summarize the findings very briefly. The chapter notes 3 main things: intent matters, context matters, and mechanisms, or how we work, matter a great deal. It was also clear that influence was usually not direct and often not immediate. As Carol Weiss reminded us, it is a bit like percolation. Ideas are put in the system, they roll around, they mix with other ideas, other evidence, and then eventually some change happens, and it's a result of a mixture of all of these things, often not traceable to 1 or 2 events. So intent. Beyond the basic intent to have an influence, we say, yes, we want to do something that is influential. That's important. But intentionality around audience was also key. Know who can you influence effectively in this setting, and know whether you're influencing through direct or indirect means. And stay clear on your objectives. That matters. On the context, we found 2 different elements of context that were important to understand. The first is general conditions in the community. As you'll see on the slides, the stability of the institutions, the absorptive capacity of the policymakers and their institutions, the governance, the nature of the governance system. You can influence in a democratic society as well as one that is not democratic, but you need to understand how the system is governed. You'll also see on that the notion that economic crises and transitions in an economy can provide special opportunities for policy influence. The second aspect of context is the decision context. That is, the openness or willingness of policymakers to consider change. Sometimes policymakers actually do seek help, and we saw some examples of that. But sometimes there's a lack of leadership or knowing what to do, or a lack of resources. Or sometimes researchers are just way ahead of the issues on policymakers, and timing and preparedness are actually crucial in those cases. Finally, in terms of the decision context, sometimes there's indifference or even active opposition to the change you're trying to create. In terms of the mechanisms, we found 4, crucial to success, but in very different ways and in very different combinations according to the situation. Strong relationship building and knowing who to build relationships with. Second, building networks of influence. You can't do it alone, you need others. Communications fit for purpose, something I've already mentioned researchers can be bad at. Understanding institutions and how they work is important to getting past opposition that you might encounter. This last is often the hardest because it takes researchers well away from the evidence and into questions of implementation that they're not used to addressing. So that's a really brief sketch, but let's look at how they played out in the 4 cases from the Knowledge to Policy book. The Latin American Trade Network was a successful network that provides evidence to trade negotiators in the region, each in their own country. The researchers in Argentina in the 1980s and 1990s, given the rapid turnover in governments, they found that their best access and influence was actually at the 3rd level of the bureaucracy, because this level of the bureaucracy did not change with each successive government. And so the new policymakers and the new senior bureaucrats had to go to them to get a handle on what the issues were and what was happening. They also, of course, found, as many do, that evidence is needed quickly. So they needed good foresight and thinking ahead about what research they needed to conduct. The other successful case of influence was a case that involved the Southern Peru Copper Corporation. The corporation was mining beside the Ilo River, just outside of a community. Of course, they deposited their tailings and they deposited them by the river. This led to leaching and, of course, to significant health problems in the community. The community was reluctant to act and even afraid to act because they were reliant on the corporation for their incomes and their livelihoods. But a small group of researchers, called Labor, investigated the health risks, met with the community over a period of time, highlighting the risks, building trust, but also highlighting a potential solution. They discovered that the International Water Tribunal 2, of which Peru was a signatory, was holding hearings. By then they had enough trust from the community that they could put forward the case to the tribunal. As it turned out, the corporation met with Labor ahead of the hearings. They reached a solution that worked for everybody and avoided the hearings and made the changes that improved the health status of that community. And the last I heard, about 5 or 6 years after the intervention, the change was holding and the community was, the tailings were still being captured in a much safer way. Then we had 2 cases that didn't work out as well. The first one involved artisanal mining. Health researchers were commissioned by a labor union to look at the health effects of high-altitude artisanal mining. And what they found is that beyond the normal risks of artisanal mining, which are many, and the normal health challenges of living at high altitudes, there were significant additional risks for some reason for doing artisanal mining at high altitudes. So they set out to promote health policies to protect the health of the miners and also address the health issues that the miners already had. But they didn't succeed. They couldn't find a way to get the miners to trust the evidence and believe that there was a problem. And of course, the government did not want the additional financial burden that the policies would commit them to. And they also, of course, had interference of the ongoing activities of the Shining Path. So they were never successful in getting changes made that they sought. And the final case was that I wanted to present in Guatemala was an education financing case. So Guatemala was coming out of a long civil war at that point. And a Mayan advocacy group was working with the Commission on Education Reform because they wanted to ensure that women and indigenous minorities had much better access to education than they had had in the past. So they were proposing financing alternatives to meet that objective. They developed a good argument, but they failed to take into account that the government of Guatemala had just put into place a One Guatemala policy. In thinking about the recovery from the Civil War, Guatemala wanted to project the image that there was one Guatemalan people, and something that promoted the idea that there actually had been some inequities would make that policy harder to represent. So in each of these cases, we see elements of intent, context, and mechanisms that are discussed in the chapters. These cases are discussed in a lot more detail in the book, Knowledge to Policy, and also I'll come back to them in Module 4 when I talk about the research and the politics of evidence. Thank you.